Looking forward to chairing this afternoon's session. We've got a fantastic agenda with two really good case studies coming up. So looking forward to hearing from colleagues shortly. So this is the sixth in a series of virtual events on provider collaboration, which we've been offering as part of a new programme of work to make sure that we're responding to the opportunities that you're facing around collaboration and also the challenges that brings. The programme focuses on sharing good practice and peer learning on a range of hot topics on provider collaboration through learning events like today. So please feel free to treat this as a safe space in which you can learn from each other. So in the context of national policy developments around provider collaboration, we don't want to lose sight of the range of models that are developing, be that at place or at scale, and our programme is focused on sharing learning from all provider types. If you haven't been able to attend our past online events, you can view the full series of webinars and read our case study briefings on our website. And you might have just noticed that we're recording this session as well so that we can share it more widely. So really looking forward to today's session in which we'll be hearing from two very different types of provider collaborative, one looking at community services, which is really interesting, and one an acute provider collaborative. We're also joined today by Christian Dingwall, who's a partner at Brown Jacobson. They're one of our Commercial Connect partners, so warm welcome to Christian as well. So in terms of the running order, we'll hear from each of our case studies in turn, but there'll be plenty of opportunity for Q&A with the panel after each presentation. So if you'd like to come in and ask a question, please just either wave your hand on screen or put up the hand function and I'll bring you in. If you prefer to use the chat function, either to steer me to ask a question or just to comment on what the presenters are talking about, or indeed to direct us in NHS providers to any of the good work that you're doing and further examples, that'll be great. So please make full use of the chat as well. I'll keep a close eye on that and make sure that I ask any questions that pop up in the chat box as well. As I said, we are recording the session, and if you don't mind just keeping on mute when you're not coming to speak, that would be fantastic. So without further ado then, and in a few moments we'll come to our first case study site, which is Mid and South Essex Community Collaborative. So warm welcome to Paul Scott, the Chief Exec of Essex Partnership University NHS Foundation Trust. Unfortunately, our colleague Jacqui from North East London can't make it today. However, we've got Christian Dingwall, a partner at Brown Jacobson, who's going to contribute to that case study. And we've also got James Wilson, the Transformation Director at the Collaborative, who's going to help with answering questions about the work that they're doing.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me okay. If there's any problems, just say something in the chat and we'll try and sort that out. This is a very shorter presentation. I'm going to speak for probably a little more than 5, but no more than 10 minutes before I hand over to Paul. And as you say, Miriam, there should be plenty of time for Q&A. If we go to the next slide, please. Provider collaboration is very much policy driven rather than legally driven, or rather there's no statutory direction for provider collaboratives. And our experience is that we've been helping providers develop collaborations and partnerships really for many years, but they are becoming much more formalised of the type in Mid and South Essex and, of course, in the Black Country. Rather than being a statutory direction for provider collaboratives, they're policy driven, and there are really two types of collaboration. There are the place-based partnerships, and then there are the provider collaboratives. From what I know of Mid and South Essex, and from what I know of the Black Country, in some ways I would describe what's happening in Mid and South Essex as a place-based partnership, and what is happening in the Black Country as a provider collaborative within the context of the NHS England policy guidance and the DHSC white papers about integration. but that's very much kind of retrospectively trying to fit descriptions of collaborations which are in policy papers that have developed after the collaborations have actually been getting off the ground. What the Health and Care Bill, though, does, following the first integration white paper, is to contain new provisions that will facilitate collaborations and place-based partnerships. And they'll facilitate it because they've got new provisions relating to joint working and delegation, joint committees and pooled funds, and they will also enable NHS England to produce statutory guidance about these joint arrangements. Some of the new provisions, for example, in relation to joint committees are in many ways quite revolutionary for the NHS. It will actually enable provider trusts to set up a joint committee, which is something that provider trusts have never been able to do in the past. And this, of course, is part of the move away from competition between NHS providers to collaboration. So there are going to be new tools that they're able to use. We've had the second integration white paper in February of this year, but that's not going to produce any new legislation on top of the Health and Care Bill, so we're told. It seems that the government is struggling enough already to produce the amended legislation under the Health and Care Bill without adding to its list of legislation. The most that will happen following the second integration white paper is potentially amendment of the Section 75 partnership regulations, which would be for inter-NHS and local authority arrangements. But nevertheless, I think that what is proposed in the Health and Care Bill will be highly helpful for NHS collaborations going forward. And if we go to the next slide, please. What I put up here is what we call the rainbow of love. This describes various ways in which NHS providers are able to develop provider collaboratives. And it starts really from on the left of this slide with looser arrangements to the middle of the slide where there are what we would call some tight agreement arrangements. And on the right of the slide is merger. And really the focus for this discussion would be on the left loose arrangements to the middle tight agreements. Many of the collaborations actually start off as relatively loose collaborations, or at least working groups. They haven't so far been able to progress to a joint committee, because that is only something that really is going to be possible with the Health and Care Bill when it's implemented. But instead they've leapfrogged committee arrangements, and like the Mid and South arrangement, they've gone in. But none of these arrangements actually work unless there is a willingness to make them work. So the first rule of any kind of partnership or collaboration, whether you're in the NHS, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're doing any kind of collaboration, is building relationships and having good trust between partners. Because no matter what kind of legal framework you could try and impose on a collaboration, if people aren't actually willing to collaborate, then there's no matter of legal superstructure that you could put on top of a collaboration. It ain't going to work. So you need to start with a collaboration of the willing. And really, we have been seeing so far, predominantly, I would suggest, three types of collaboration: the loose collaboration, the working group, often a working group describes itself as committees in common or something like that. But really, the way that the legislation works at the moment, they are normally going to be working groups. As I say, we leapfrog over joint committees, and we go from to a contractual joint venture. And with a contractual joint venture, they have become really reasonably common. And for example, you can have back office pathology service or other back and middle office functions. They are often set up as contractual joint ventures. There are also some lead provider arrangements. They tend to be, for example, around specialised mental health services, where NHS England is delegating to a lead provider, but then subcontracts. But our experience at the moment is, as I say, most collaborations are either loose collaborations, working groups, or contractual joint ventures. We would, I think, probably recommend, if not strongly recommend, that you avoid corporate joint ventures for this type of collaboration, not least because of NHS Trust's restricted powers to enter into corporate joint ventures. Foundation trusts have got reasonably wide powers, but even they, to some extent, are now curtailed by the need to consult NHS England before setting up a corporate subsidiary. Sometimes collaborations do lead to mergers, but they tend to be where two organisations are really working towards a merger, and they see collaboration as being a precursor to a merger arrangement. And I don't think that this provider collaboratives of the type that we're discussing are intended to lead to mergers. If we go to the next slide, please. Some of the frequently asked questions that are put to us about provider collaborations I've set out on this slide. And I'm going to give you some very high-level answers to these type of questions, because I think they're very much for potentially for discussion during Q&A. The first one is there a prescribed process to establish a provider collaborative? And the answer to that one is no. You start off on the basis of coalition of the willing and you work from that. What legal steps are needed for a formal provider collaborative? Potentially no legal steps are required to establish a formal provider collaborative, but if you are going to enter into an arrangement which contains legal responsibilities, the sharing of, for example, decision making, we would recommend that you should undertake some legal steps, for example, by way of a contractual joint venture. Can providers choose to restrict who they collaborate with? Only up to a point. I think it's going to become more difficult for providers to try to restrict who they collaborate with because of the policy directive that underlies provider collaboration. Or are all providers equal in a provider collaborative? The answer to that is it all depends who you're collaborating with, because there may be some less important collaborators and there may be core collaborators. So we often see full members and associate members, that type of terminology. Can providers share decision making when they collaborate? They can share a lot of decision making at the moment, and going forward with amendment of the legislation, they'll be able to share even more. Next question, how do providers manage conflicts of interest when they collaborate? That's a knotty area, conflicts of interest, and I think that it involves a discussion by itself. So I think that conflicts of interest is something I wouldn't try to give you an instant answer to. How do providers enter and exit an existing provider collaborative? That's really when it helps to have a properly structured legal document, I think, for that sort of issue. And again, with accountability and liability, I would strongly recommend that there is a documented legal arrangement which would cover that. As for the legal relationship between an ICB and a provider collaborative, broadly speaking, going forward, we expect there to be three types of relationship. One would be no legal relationship. We think that will be not really viable to have no legal relationship. Secondly, there would be a relationship of delegation. That would be under the new delegation powers proposed by the Health and Care Bill. And the third type of legal relationship would be what is probably most common at the moment, is a contractual relationship. So those are some of the frequently asked questions and some of the kind of very high level answers that we would give. And I think that would take me to the point where I would hand over to Paul, please.
Thanks, Christian. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Scott. I'm Chief Exec of Essex Partnership Foundation Trust. We provide mental health services and community services in Essex and beyond. And I'm one of 3 Chief Execs working on the collaborative. If we could go to the next slide. So we're operating in Mid and South Essex, which is a strange bit of geography carved out of the county of Essex. Quite a diverse population economically, lots of urban and rural diversity as well, and a range of health and care providers. And 2 key drivers, I guess, for the formation of the collaborative was the merger of 3 acute trusts into one, which obviously drove a request for consistency across the patch from a discharge perspective. And 3 local authorities, 2 of which are unitary authorities in Southend and Thurrock, but a bigger local authority in Essex County Council, who are perplexed by working with a multitude of health organisations and are always pushing for simplicity. So there was a little bit of a push there from 2 organisations, and the Commission has picked that up and said, look, if you come together as a collaborative with the change in commissioning arrangements and competition arrangements, we can stabilise provision in this area, or we will go to tender. So there was a little bit of push to do this, but to start it off. But I guess, as Christian's pointed out, it was underpinned by mutual respect and trust between the 3 organisations. If we could go to the next slide. So our vision, and we've been live since October 21, and our vision is to provide a consistent and outstanding community and healthcare services for the patch we provide to. And that's driven by those reasons from Essex County Council and the new acute trust as well. And there's 3 quite different organisations actually participating. There's us as a mental health and community provider. There's North East London Foundation Trust, which is a similar organisation to us, but operating on a different geography, and Provide, who are our community interest company. So we're coming from very different perspectives and operating across multiple boundaries, whether they're ICBs, whether they're sectors, because Provide works outside the NHS and care quite a lot as well. So a diverse set of people coming together and trying to solve a common problem. Next slide, please. So a quick overview. October 21, we started. We've got our vision. We've agreed our priorities, which I don't think are too challenging to anybody conceptually. But the key bit is that we've got a programme, a structure to deliver that through. So we've got a joint programme of change that we've agreed. We have shared delivery teams. We've got integrated place-based leadership, and this is relatively new for us, but we've put in place joint leadership in our places. And they're at least mental health and community, but in one place, a mental health, community and social care as well. We've agreed joint governance from boards with delegation to a chair-led collaborative board, and it's all underpinned by a contractual joint venture. Next slide, please. Christian's just talked you through some of the processes you can go through to get to agreements in place that will help you do the work you're trying to do. And this is just setting out the journey we've been on since May 2020 to going live in October 21, and then taking on full delegate authority of the board. And it's not October 22, is it? 21. So it's taken about a year and a half from conception to execution, I'd say. And that's felt like an awfully short time to do it, but when you look at it like this, it looks like quite a long time. So I think there's a balance between patience and making sure you keep moving forward. And this is really just the skeleton, I guess, for for the work we've done together, and really important skeleton because it structures your conversations. It helps build that shared understanding. It helps everyone give a structure of understanding to how to do business together. But I think, as Christian's pointed out, if we go to the next slide, that it really is focused about people, and individuals have driven this, and the individual relationships between people have. So we've got the core reason for what we're doing it for, but people coming forward and taking a bit of risk, being open, and taking time to get to know each other, really understand the different purposes of the organisation, the different perspectives, making some investments together, but also understanding that you can't set out a clear path forward, right? You can't say, here is our plan and we're going to deliver this plan, because there's so many variables at play. There's different organisations that you're working with, but there's different asks and needs of the collaborative from the wider health and care system. So a lot of this we nudged forward, discovered a bit, and nudged forward again. We just got back from our board this morning that I'll talk to you about some of the discussions we're having later, but we're into another phase of development now, thinking through what we're for and what we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please. I've mentioned some of the things we've delivered, and it's really important to reflect on the successes of the collaboration. And we've got, we think, quite groundbreaking process in place now that we're appointed 4 place-based joint director roles, but they're not just within the collaborative, they're within the collaborative and serving beyond the collaborative as well. And I've mentioned mental health and social care there, and that's quite hard to get your head around, and we've worked quite hard locally to understand that, but it's so important when you're driving that integration. You can't look at a collaborative as a thing on its own. The whole purpose of a collaborative is to bring people together, but also to make it easier to partner with other parts of the system as well. So we've got quite innovative, I think, appointments there. We've I don't want to use the word won because we're not in competition, but we have acquired more services, and that's again without competition. So that's people starting to trust us with services that would have gone to tender before. So we've taken on a children's service in Southend, and we will then use that to work out our redesign across the whole patch for children's services. And we've really harnessed that collaborative where you would have had 3 organisations working on winter pressures separately. We're now coming together and we're able to put a really good case together, and we're delivering extremely good results for the development and implementation of the virtual hospitals and the urgent demand we're managing in the system at the moment. So real impact on delivery, I'd say, even though we've only had a short period of time together. Next slide. So there's ongoing challenges, right? And there's some here around keeping our focus is important. The ICBs are changing every day, and what they're asking for and what dynamics are coming out of that continue to play into our conversations. And then we're balancing quite a few things off around, you know, there's a collaborative, there's organisational accountability, there's different politics in those organisations and the patches they serve. But really, I guess we got into a conversation today at board about where does this go? We can say, look, we've got the collaboration, we've got this sort of consistency across the patch, we've done some really good things together, so we can just carry on doing good stuff, right? But there's more needed in the integration of health and care, and we're getting into conversations now, especially with the formation of ICBs, about are we a provider collaborative? Or are we starting to think about being a commissioning collaborative with the opportunities that arise from delegation from ICBs? Always with collaboration, I think, and this has been a real challenge for us, is where's the accountability? And we've really, you know, not struggled because it hasn't been a massive issue for us right now, but we struggle conceptually with it, and that will become increasingly important as we go forward. That accountability to be driven by what kind of organisation are we in? Oh, well, we're not even an organisation. What kind of collaboration are we? Are we a commissioning collaboration or a providing collaboration? And that will then drive the governance. You know, what kind of decision-making, authority, oversight and scrutiny do we need to deliver our objectives? And then that plays into resources, because one of the real challenges we've got is reconciling the fact we're having to put in some collaborative resource to manage infrastructure, to manage the strategy and the program of work, which increases the cost of the collaborative, right? So that's not really what we're here for. We're here to be more effective, more efficient. So how do we reconcile all of that and harness our existing resources to make sure we move forward? And that should influence how we design the governance. And one of the challenges on the governance is the natural place to go is to replicate organisational governance, but that really undermines the flexibility, the notion of partnership, and the notion that you're trying to empower people locally to make better decisions. So we haven't got an answer at the moment. We're still working through that, but the process of the contractual joint venture, the explicitness of those conversations did help us to unpack what we needed at the time. And I think the board today agreed that we need to go through that process again to unpack what we need for the future. So that's where we are now, in transition, quite a bit of success, a bit of a roller coaster getting here, but underpinned by trust, good behaviours, and a little bit of energy and threat from commissioners. So I'll leave it there, and I think we can take questions now, Miriam.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you ever so much. And Christian as well, for really open presentation, and nice kind of sparky prompt that you ended on there around the kind of commissioner threat and support, which we'll come back to. So colleagues, please do raise your hands if you'd like to ask the question or drop something into the chat. In the meantime, while you're mulling over what to ask, I wondered, Paul, if you could just unpack for us a little bit more that journey that you've been on as a partnership in terms of the model that you went for. So you mentioned there that the JV has served a particular purpose in getting things going, but you were alluding to perhaps reviewing that as the governance becomes more refined over time. So obviously on Christian's slide there are a range of options, and colleagues and different trusts do go for different models. So just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how you arrived at the JV option initially and where you think it might evolve going forwards.
Yeah, if I'm honest, Miriam, I can't. We went through a process together about looking at the options exactly as Christian has set out and what's the most practical for what we needed at the time. And our ambition was to get more consistent, to come together, and we talked about an actual JV, not a contractual JV. We talked about loose partnerships. But the balance that you got with a contractual JV that was explicit and legally framed, but not necessarily a legal entity in itself, was the right balance for us at the time. And I think one of the things I've learned through this is actually don't start with that. Don't start with what's the vehicle. Start with what you're trying to achieve, and the conversation about what you build to support what you're trying to achieve, whether it's a CJV or loose collaboration, will become easier. What we found with the contractual JV and making sure we had that sort of legal conversation and legal explicitness was that it drew out all the issues through that process, and we were able to overcome them, be very clear with each other, expose any differences. And before we started work, we'd done all that work. What I'm suggesting we're doing now is that the landscape and context has changed, and we've delivered some stuff. So now is a good time to reflect again on what we think is needed in terms of delivery and serving the system and the population, and then that will drive a conversation. I'll go back a bit. We started a conversation today at board about what should the governance be. What we ended up saying is what's needed, and actually we're not sure. So we'll do a bit of work to work out what's needed, and then we'll come back and have a look at how governance can serve that best.
Thank you. Helpful. And Christian, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add to that briefly, and then I'll come to colleagues who've got hands up. I can see Tansy and Deborah have both got hands up, so I'll come to you in a second. Is there anything you'd add to that briefly, Christian?
Yeah, very briefly. I think that Paul has set out a really good process to follow. I would say two comments. The first is that the white papers talk about getting rid of complexity and bureaucracy. I would say that these arrangements are just inevitably complex, that you can't get away from complexity, but nevertheless do try to keep it simple. Don't go for any unnecessary complexity. do try to keep it as simple as possible, because these things are just inevitably complex, and you just don't need to make your life more complex than it's already going to be.
Sound advice. Thank you, Christian. Tansy, if I come to you, you wanted to come in.
Thank you very much, and I've really enjoyed it. I've always been on the commissioning side and recently gone into a provider organisation, and that lovely comment just made about keep it simple. What's been the learning and development for the individual boards through this process? Because I imagine you've involved your chairs, but it's about how those boards have moved to let go and get in. Again, keeping it simple, you can't always involve them. So what's been that learning and development?
Paul, do you want to tackle that?
What's been the, well, I think it's involve your chairs. So our chairs have been heavily involved. Our NEDs have probably struggled a bit more to be consistently involved, but we've got one or two that are supporting the chairs and very involved in that work. And again, it comes back to process, right? So you've got two things going on here. You've got behaviours, trust, relationships, and then you've got process. And the process has been very important for keeping the boards together on this. So that development of the CJV meant we had to bring documents at regular intervals to the board. We had to be very explicit. And we took baby steps as well. So we just went every now and again with an update. And Christian said, keep it simple. So we kept it simple as we could. And we didn't push boundaries that didn't need pushing. So some boards didn't want to go as far as others. So we left it at that. So the lowest common denominator really was where we went to. But that was quite helpful as well. That tension was quite helpful because it kept us focused on a deliverable that we could achieve together rather than trying to save the whole world in one move, which has given us a really good platform for the conversation we've got to have this summer, I'd say.
Thanks, Paul. Helpful. Deborah.
Thank you. Yes, I really useful and really interesting. You did say that you'd struggled a bit with working out what kind of organisation you were, whether you were a provider or whether you were commissioning. And I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how you managed that discussion and how you thought that through, because I think managing the change, especially for boards and NEDs as well, is going to be quite tricky. Yeah,
you fell into the same trap as me, Deborah. We're not an organisation. We're a coming together of organisations in a collaborative, which I keep having to remember. And I guess we started off very clearly as a provider collaborative, right? We wanted to make the provision of our services better. And that kept it nice and simple, as Christian has advised us. The provocation to about commissioning is now with the formation of ICBs. They're starting to think through how they structure themselves, are starting to think through how they can take down some of the boundaries. And in Mid and South Essex, we're talking about organisations hosting whole pathways, right? And using those pathways to empower, enable, give permission to clinicians or leaders within multiple providers to come up with better solutions. And essentially that provokes the commissioning question, right? So I think what we can start there. We've created a platform that, as opportunities like that provocation from the ICB present themselves, we're in a really good position to start thinking through, can we offer something there? So that's the sort of journey we've been on. It wasn't an explicit, we'll go provider, then we'll go commissioning, and then we'll take over the world. It was, let's just do that bit and then see what happens. And it's just put us in a good position to adapt to the changing context.
Thanks, Paul. I think that'll be really reassuring to lots of colleagues, because I think everyone's finding their way with some of this stuff, aren't they? So it's really interesting. I think perhaps there's a bit of a follow-on question to that in the chat from Peter as well, asking, is there a plan for how to use the glue of current commissioning resources and functions in the provider collaborative going forwards? So I guess that's potentially about the transfer of some resource and using the ICB, I guess, as kind of glue, as kind of holding the ring a little bit helpfully.
There's no plan, but what I might do is I might put James Wilson, our transformation director, on the spot, who is part funded by our commissioners. So
sorry, James. There you go.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I guess so. I guess I am one of those resources. So I'm in a role as transformation director with the pleasure of having four bosses. So I report to the 3 chief executives across the collaborative, but also the accountable officer of the system, and still hold a bit of that kind of commissioning functionality. And I guess I think that's good, that I've been able to have the kind of commissioning oversight view, but also the support of the formation of the collaborative. And I think we're in kind of early conversations now as part of that ICB setup around how that historic commissioning resource, where the kind of skills and functionality of that, how can that help being more as one with the provider collaborative teams. And that might be a sort of number of steps to that, so it doesn't assume kind of a full transfer into the collaborative, but it might be more matrix management from the transition into the ICB, those teams working much closer together and eroding the sort of bad bits of commissioning, if you like, where they're kind of us and them part. But I think there's still a need to have those skills within a collaborative arrangement moving forward. And I think that will really then empower and enable us to move a bit further forward with some of that transformation work. But I think it probably has helped us manage and be closer to the ICB development by having my role, which kind of spans a bit of both over the past year or so.
Yeah. Thanks, James. It's a really interesting model. I'm just mindful of the time. We've probably got time for at least one more question before we move to our second presentation. So I'll bring in Marek. Not sure if I pronounced your name correctly.
Yes, you did. I was going to comment on the same stream of communication, but because of the time, I'll sneak in my second question, if this is okay. I think, Paul, one of the slides described a lot of relationship building, or at least gave a theme of the relationship building. When you look at the very helpful slide of loose collaboration to formal collaboration, I think it speaks to some of the learning coming from, I gathered from a random article from Integrated Care Journal, which said that the formal arrangements occur in the last year or two of 5, 6, 7 years of loose collaborations. What sort of particular dedicated tools, tactics, or behaviors did you use to foster the relationship, the trust, and the behaviors?
Well, it's interesting actually, because the 3 chief execs who drove this were all relatively new. So provide me, I've been in post 15 months, so I sort of picked up this after it was conceived, and there's been a couple of chief execs in Nelft. So I guess I think the conditions that were created were policy permission. As Christian pointed out, the policy changes set a direction, and the recruitment approach of the 3 organisations was to recruit collaborative leaders, right? So those 2 things together meant we didn't have the history of competition. We had the purpose that we were recruited for. We had the mandate about collaboration. So that really sort of quick started us in a way, and it was just a case of it was a good excuse to go out for lots of dinners with those 2 chief execs, and the chairs played a massive role as well in encouraging us. So I think it's 4 things. Sorry, policy, people, the boards and the chairs, and then the little bit of energy that was put in from the commissioners to say, if you don't do something, we'll do something. Which sort of brought a bit of focus to us as well. So I think those 4 things, it didn't need 7 years. It just needed a few dinners.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for being so honest about your journey so far. It's been really interesting. So thanks to Paul, Christian, and James. If you're able to stay with us, we might be able to throw a few more questions your way before the end of the session. But meantime, I'm just going to move us on to hear from our second case study today. So warm welcome to Diane Wake, Chief Executive of the Dudley Group NHS Foundation Trust, and to Dr. Jonathan Odum, Medical Director at the Royal Wolverhampton NHS Trust. And you're going to talk to us a little bit about an acute collaborative, the Black Country Provider Collaborative. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Jonathan and I are going to do a little bit of a double act today, so I hope that you can bear with us. We won't take longer than the 20 minutes, but we'll just run through what we've been doing within the Black Country and share that with you this afternoon. So next slide, please. Okay. So we formed the Black Country Acute Provider Collaborative back in 2020. And I think within the Black Country, we have been on a bit of a journey. I think it's not always been an easy system to work in. I've now been in the system 5 years, but many people have been in the system much longer than me. But I think in the last 18 months, I think relationships across the 4 providers that sit within the Black Country has never been better. And I think we've transitioned from compete to one that's a relationship between the 4 providers, which is much more around collaboration and partnership working. And I think because we've got a real track record now in that 18-month period of collaboration together, it's developed trust and positivity between the 4 providers. One of the things that we have talked about, but we've agreed to park, is about the form bit of our provider collaborative. But I think where we've parked it is that for now, the 4 constituent boards will remain within the Black Country with the 4 providers. But one of the things that we have talked about as the opportunity arises is potentially transitioning to one chair across the 4 providers within our system. And actually 2 of the providers now already has one shared chair. So there is an opportunity with 10 years coming to an end that we could potentially transition to that. But that's as far as we've got in terms of focusing on that organisational form piece. And what I'm proud to say, and I think what's got us to the position of where we are today, is that this programme is fundamentally clinically led and clinically driven. And Jonathan Odum has been absolutely instrumental in that, with the 9 system clinical leads that we've appointed in the last 18 months. And a lot of that work is enabled also by a corporate programme that we've got running alongside that, which focuses very much on digital workforce and corporate functions. So if we just want to go to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to walk you through the programme governance. I don't want to take too much time because Jonathan's going to do all the really good, interesting stuff around clinical. So but I will talk you through governance because I think people will find this interesting. So next slide, please. So this slide is the governance arrangements that we put in place back in December 2020. So you'll see at the top, each board remains as a sovereign accountable entity and existing accountability and responsibilities remain. The 4 organisations involved in the Black Country, for people that are not aware of that, are Royal Wolverhampton Trust, Walsall Healthcare Trust, the Dudley Group Foundation Trust, and Sandwell and West Birmingham. So they're the 4 providers that are part of this acute care collaboration. And what we did underneath where you can see those 4 blue boxes, we formed the Acute Care Collaboration Programme Board, which is constituted by chairs and chief executives. And then we've got key directors of strategy and key executive directors across the 4 providers who lead on the different programmes that we've put together as part of the programme that we've taken forward for the last 18 months, supported by intelligence and insight and fundamentally the clinical improvement programme, which has been led by Jonathan and supported by myself and the other system leads. Then to the right in the pink boxes, we've got our SDP as it was, the ICS, soon to be ICB and ICPs, and what sits underneath that and how that aligns currently. So that they were the governance arrangements that we were working to from December 2020. If we can just move on to the next slide, and I'll just try and describe on the next slide the programme that we put in place in December. So as you can see, we've got the programme board, which I've described. Then we had a group fundamentally looking at governance and implementation, which reported up to that board. And then the big clinical improvement programme that Jonathan's going to talk to. And we've had a number of clinical summits to agree the programmes of work that we've focused on with all of our providers across our system. The intelligence, insight and outcomes has been absolutely fundamental to understanding where we did need to focus. So actually gathering all of that data, having that intelligence has been absolutely fundamental to the work plan that's driven the clinical improvement programme. And then alongside that, we've got the leadership and workforce programme, which has been overseen by the people board, but reports directly into the programme board for the collaborative as well. And within that, we've looked at passporting of staff, we've looked at aligning waiting list initiative rates across our 4 providers, etc. And then we've got the back office, as we've called it previously. Nobody likes that term, so we've now turned that to the corporate functions, where we've been looking at how do we manage payroll, how do we manage procurement together. And actually, I think we've missed a trick in terms of what we've achieved around some of that. So we've got one trust currently within our system that actually provides payroll to the world, apart from the other 3 providers in the Black Country. So why aren't we part of that? And we had an interesting discussion only last week about that actually we've just got to do this and just move it forward. And similarly with procurement, we've got one trust in our system that has procurement provided on a much larger scale than 3 of the other trusts. And again, that's something where we feel we can get a real quick win. So if we just move on to the next slide, this was the programme that we put in place and we drafted from 2020 onwards. We've not achieved all of this, so this was about scoping it out, understanding the vision, getting the intelligence, engaging within local place, engaging within our system, then putting those plans into place and then moving to implementation. We've always been clear that as the outputs have emerged, particularly from the clinical work stream, we would have to develop a case for change. And we've only just got to that point now where actually by the end of Q1, we should have a case for change as work from those clinical summits and some of the work that the system clinical leads have done has begun to emerge in terms of how we can begin that transformation. So the next slide just really describes the programme plan and timing, and I'm more than happy again for these slides to be shared. I haven't got the time to go through this in detail, but we basically put it into phases, phase 1, 2 and 3 in terms of what we expected to deliver. We've recognised that as we move forward into this new era of ICSs and having the ICB and the ICPs going forward, that we would have to review our governance. And what the next slide describes is what happened at our meeting last week in terms of what the governance needs to look like from April 2022 going forward. The slide I've just shown, which was the programme plan, is we are doing a formal review of that. So we're doing a formal review so that we can conclude what have we achieved in the last 18 months and formally report that within the governance arrangements, which I'm just about to describe. So what we agreed at our board meeting on last Thursday, and it's just on the next slide, is what the board structure and the governance might look like going forward. So you can see at the top in blue, we've got the Black Country Provider Collaborative Board. So we've decided that we wanted to drop the acute bit and we actually wanted to focus on providers. And one of the other things we wanted to look at was we've had a rotational chair chairing that board as it was. So chairs from the providers had taken it in turn to chair it. And we decided actually we needed a permanent chair, someone that could absolutely commit to it. And so Sir David Nicholson, who is chair of one of our trusts, volunteered to be chair of that provider collaborative board. So he's going to take that up on a permanent basis, which I think will be really helpful and give us that continuity. One of the things that we really thought we were missing, because when we reviewed how that board was functioning, we were making a lot of operational decisions. We weren't functioning as a board from that assurance piece. So what we agreed was we need to put in an executive group below that, where all of the work will be done, and we can then recommend up to the board and provide assurance to the board, etc. So we've agreed that the board will meet quarterly. The first board meeting for this year will be in June, so it could be June, September, December, and then March 2023. But the executive group will meet monthly because there's so much to do. We need to revise the terms of reference, agree the membership, and we've also said as part of the provider collaborative board, we want to be inclusive and not exclusive. So if we've got providers within our system that want to be part of that, then let's agree with them. Do they want to be full members or associate members? So we're just looking at how that's going to work and what those terms of reference need to look like going forward. And so the big bubble to the left, so the blue bubble, you can see we've got the previous portfolio that we had, the clinical improvement programme and the work streams, and we see that those will continue to exist, reporting up to the executive and up to the board. And again, the bubble in the middle is about the governance. We're developing a governance paper to describe what things will look like from April going forward. So there'll be a comprehensive document that we'll take to our executive meeting, which meets on the 21st of April, to firm some of this up. And that'll also describe our comms and engagement plan, etc. The bit that we're all working on is that how will this align with the ICS and the ICB? So in the green boxes and the pink boxes, some of the committees and groups that sit within the ICS at the moment. So I currently chair the elective and diagnostic group and the cancer board, which reports up to the ICS, and one of our other chief execs chairs the urgent care board. And again, they're supported by operational groups and a diagnostic improvement programme. Again, we need to agree within our ICS, actually, will they report into the provider collaborative going forward, or the report into the ICB? And I think at the moment what we have agreed is that they're probably going to have to do both until we can get this resolved and sorted out. I think we can really make a case for elective and diagnostics to sit and report into the provider collaborative board, but I think there's such a crossover in terms of place and other people that play their part in terms of urgent care and cancer. So I think this is going to be iterative as we go through 2022 into 2023, but what we want to do is really get ourselves geared up as a provider collaborative so that we can have a lot of the delegated functions delegated down to the provider collaborative board within our system. And then on my next slide, it really just again, it's just a shortened version of what I've described in terms of the board, the executive programme board, the clinical and back office groups, and then the networks and delivery work streams that form the governance of that previous slide that I've just described. So I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, and he's going to talk about some of the real exciting work that we've done as part of the clinical improvement programme, which has really been the crux of the work that we've done in the last 18 months. So I'll hand over to you, Jonathan.
Hi, thanks very much, Diane. And I think, so first just to introduce myself, yes, I'm Jonathan Odum, and I'm the Chief Medical Officer at the Royal Wolverhampton Trust. It's actually been a privilege to take on the medical directorship of the acute collaborative, which has now become the provider collaborative. And I think the first thing to say from my perspective is that I think in no small way is the success that we've achieved to date is because of the commitment at board level from the organisations, and I'll particularly say that Diane's support as the SRO to the whole process has been invaluable. So I think so just seeing where we were a few years ago, and Diane's absolutely right. I've worked in the system here. I've worked in Wolverhampton for almost 30 years now. And really, up until relatively recently, it has been competition between the four organisations in the Black Country, and that has now fundamentally changed. So, if you just go to the next slide, please. So, the four acute trusts have agreed now that they will come together as the collaborative, and the clinical services will be worked on network basis. So, and the networking will be decided and discussed and ultimately signed off by the clinicians involved, and they'll be provided through hub and spoke where appropriate. And that's pretty much how each of those services is currently working through. So if you just go to the next slide, please. So we've had a series of clinical engagements, and they have been phenomenally well attended. There's no doubt that COVID has had a significant impact in terms of the timing and the attendance. But once the clinicians essentially were informed in each of the organisations that we were going to look to have collaboration and networking within our system and between our organisations, I think to start off with, there was a very healthy scepticism about it. But nevertheless, over a period of probably some months, there was a very strong acceptance that the networking was going to happen. The chief execs and the chairman and the boards were signed up to this. And I think it opened up the real opportunities between the different clinical specialties as to how they might look to want to develop their specialties into networks, which would provide better accessibility for the patient population, but also improved outcomes and also address some of the inequalities that we've got within the system. So where we started out was to look at where our priority clinical pressures were. And there were 6 surgical specialties which align themselves to the Midlands Elective Delivery Programme, if you're familiar with that. I won't go through them in detail, but nevertheless, what we did is that we advertised and appointed clinical leads through the collaborative. And there was a lot of interest and some very high caliber individuals who applied and were appointed. And we gave them 2 sessions of time, so essentially a day a week, which is what we felt was realistic in terms of the time commitment that they would need to put in to develop the networking proposals. And they have each done that. We also chose 4 cancer pathways, which were, again, there were some lengthy delays in terms of the various targets for those. So we focused in on skin, colorectal, urology and breast cancer, and appointed leads into those. And as you can see there, the focus really was about how do we improve the outcomes and the accessibility. What I'm going to do is just take just a couple of these and use them as examples. I know that time is pressing here, and just to explain what has happened as illustration. So if you go to the next slide, and the next one. So critical care was a high priority for us during the pandemic, with real pressure on critical care beds. And we've appointed a critical care lead as well, and that is essentially to bring the critical care units across the 4 organisations together in terms of looking at level 3, level 2, level 1 and respiratory support unit requirements. And that has been a really excellent exercise across the 4 organisations, and I think we now have a very clear picture of what the requirements are within each of our organisations. And that's partly about delivering business as usual, but it's also about delivering in terms of further pandemics. So if you go to the next slide. So orthopaedics is one of the surgical specialties, and like the rest of the country, it's where some of our lengthy waiters are. And we've appointed an orthopaedic surgeon from Diane's organisation who has really been centrepiece in terms of the networking with all the other organisations. And he's been very successful in bringing together the teams and looking at to how we can structure services within the Black Country. And essentially, we came to a couple of options, but the main option was that we should have 2 orthopaedic hubs in the Black Country, one in the north and one in the south. And we would deliver pretty much all the elective orthopaedic activity through those 2 hubs. And that is now very close to being signed off. In terms of just to focus on the North Hub, we've decided will be in Cannock Chase Hospital, which is an elective hospital which is run by Royal Wolverhampton Trust. And it has 7 operating theatres. And we've been successful in being awarded some money through the targeted investment funding. So we're looking to have another 2 theatres built there this year and another 2 next year. And what we can do through the networking arrangement is pretty much look to have all the elective orthopaedic activity delivered between Wolverhampton, Walsall and Dudley through that elective hub. And that's a discussion which is in place at the moment. And when it comes into being, what it will do is it will provide a completely green site within the Black Country for the elective activity of orthopaedics to be delivered through. And we should, working through the 6 days, 2.5 sessions, 6 days and 2.5 sessions a day, be able to crack through that workload. Ultimately, we want to have a second hub in Sandwell, but that's work in progress. But I don't think we'd be anywhere near delivering this if we hadn't had the collaboration through the through the collaborative and supported by the networking leads, because to do this from a standing start would have been pretty much impossible. So next slide, please. Skin cancer and skin services is another very high pressured service within the Black Country, and we appointed 2 skin cancer leads. And what they have come up with is a radical solution, although it is in line with the British Dermatology Association recommendations. And it takes us away from the traditional referrals and the outpatient clinics that we have at the moment. And what they are looking to do is to introduce teledermatology across the whole of the Black Country, which means educating all our dermatologists, all our GPs in terms of how they need to use that. And at a stroke, when we've achieved that, it will allow all the non-malignant and other and some of the other benign conditions to be screened out, and only those that need to be seen in secondary care will be referred up and routinely managed. So the way that we would do that is we'd have multi-specialty super clinics in the Black Country. We'd have a skin cancer hub, and we'd align that to both biopsies and plastic surgery work. And the streamlining of all of that, the modelling tells us, will take us away from a very lengthy waits that we've got at the moment through to some to much more sort of manageable timescales over the coming months, certainly within the next 18 months. We're also looking to potentially develop a skin cancer hub, although that's relatively expensive, so there may be a time delay to that. But nevertheless, the skin cancer, the skin specialists are pretty much agreed between themselves now that that's the model that they would like to introduce across the Black Country. So next slide, please. So breast cancer is another service where we've again very much had lengthy waits across the patch, and the breast cancer breast surgical lead has done some really excellent work in networking between the 4 organisations. And just in brief, where he's got to is developed a model which looks at a 2-centre oncoplastic reconstructive site model, with the other 2 centres providing sort of more routine breast surgery. And by carving up the workforce and looking at the networking, we can manage a system which will take us away from the relatively lengthy waits and the inequality in waits that we have across the system, to deliver oncoplastic surgery and reconstructive surgery within the Black Country using plastic surgical expertise, which we will need to develop, but also then look to use the other sites for the more routine and sort of high volume but more routine breast services. What has been highlighted through the discussions is there are workforce deficits, there are training deficits, and there's a whole lot of other work that we need to be doing across the board in terms of looking at our workforce. But we believe that the networking and the sort of specialisation, which seems to be really attractive to the clinicians, will be a bit of a magnet in terms of attracting in trainees and others to want to work in these units. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there. That's given you, I know we're probably over time, but I hope that's given you an insight into how the networking has worked. And I don't know if Diane's got time to say anything about the back office functions, but actually that's looking pretty successful as well.
Yeah, I think we've just got to, from a back office point of view, just do it. I think that we've all procrastinated, and some of it doesn't make sense in terms of where we are. You know, the example I gave around one of our trusts providing payroll to everybody apart from the three trusts in the Black Country. We just need to make a decision and go with it. But obviously, we do need to have to take into consideration our people and how we do that, and make sure that we do that in the right way, because that's also equally important. I think just one other thing, just on the clinical work, we have Jonathan's just given examples of 4 of the specialties that we've worked on, but we've got really well-established networks for urology, vascular and cardiology. So again, they're delivering an awful lot, and urology is well-established in terms of the hub and spoke model, and we're just embedding robotics across our system. So robotics is currently provided at Wolverhampton, but we are training the urologists in the other sites to be able to do robotics, and that's been well established between Dudley and Wolverhampton for quite a while, and we're looking at investing in robotics in 2 of the other sites and aligning that to our robotics strategy for the system. And similarly with vascular, we've got a hub and spoke model for vascular that's well embedded and works very well, but we've got a small amount of our work that goes into another ICS, and we'd like the opportunity to bring that back and expand. And some of these moves of clinical services will enable some of that, because we need to free up theatre capacity in the site that currently does vascular to allow some of that to happen. So we view this as a bit of a clinical jigsaw puzzle in terms of how all this will work and how we can align the vision and ambition of the clinical leads. But it's been quite an exciting 18 months, and we're getting to the point where we are engaging with partners. We've got a communication and engagement strategy, which is absolutely key in terms of taking our partners locally within place and within the system with us. And we've constantly kept warming up local authorities via overview and scrutiny committees to keep them on board with the work that we're doing. And I'll pause.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Jonathan. Such a rich presentation. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. We have got time for a couple of questions, actually. Although, as is always the case, I feel like we could talk to you all day about that. There was so much there. But I'll start with a question from the chat, which was on my mind as well. I suppose it's just what you were alluding to there, Diane, about the sort of comms and engagement piece and bringing people with you, because it's quite a cultural shift, isn't it, for people to go from supporting, feeling like they're most aligned with a trust to being aligned with a network across a system. So there's a question in the chat from Marek about how you might have turned outstanding clinicians into outstanding system clinical leads, but I think it probably applies to the entire staff base across the piece, doesn't it, really? I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you did that.
Yeah, I think the clinical summits have really been the catalyst and have really helped us, and we wanted to have the clinical summits much earlier than we did. So we ended up having the first one in June of last year, and that was all due to COVID restrictions, that we couldn't bring people together at scale. But we've been doing a lot of work outside of that big engagement session, and I think we really began to get the momentum going with our clinicians at that first one. And we've just had the 4th one in March, and there was over 200 people there across the 4 providers, and the buzz in the room, the energy, the enthusiasm. Honestly, I would have described 5 years ago working in the Black Country like the Wild West, but honestly it is a different place in terms of how people are working together, collaborating. I think a lot of the work that we've done around elective recovery, mutual aid, in terms of trying to work through some of the challenged cancer specialties, which I lead on for the system as well, has really helped us and got us to a good place. We've already got patients that are moving around our hospitals so that we can actually deliver them their care in a timely manner. We've had a lot of GP engagement, so we've set up forums with the GPs, both locally within place, but we've brought them together within our clinical summits as well to talk to them about what we're wanting to do and what the vision is for each of the clinical services. And again, we're just about to do another round of those, and we've done a similar thing with overview and scrutiny committees. And once we've developed our case for change, which will hopefully be finished by the end of Q1, we want to go to the OSCs with that, rather than going piecemeal with, right, we want to do this with breast, we want to do this with urology. And I think we're going to get a bit of pushback. You're always going to get that, but as we've been doing the work, we've been looking at transport links, what's the appetite of patients, and we've tested that out with our local populations as well. But I think COVID has helped a lot of this in terms of really getting people to think differently and recognising that, you know, this is not about competing. Collaboration gets you much further, much faster, and it's much more pleasant to do that rather than competing with each other.
I agree with that. Anything to add to that, Jonathan? Does that capture it from your point of view?
No, I think Diane's absolutely right. You know, I think the collaboration has been ultimately very willing. I think the summits and the commitment of the 4 organisations coming together has been liberating to clinicians, to move them away from the, you know, the competition and the collaboration. And frankly, I think COVID probably has helped, because it's kept us all in our boxes in our own organisations, and getting out and meeting people and having the opportunity to discuss clinical services and where the challenges are, and then looking to develop solutions it's been overwhelmingly rewarding, not just to us, who frankly I think were a bit uncertain how it was going to pan out, but certainly to the clinicians involved. And I think some of the other developments that I've talked about, and just taking the opportunities of, for example, some of the funding coming into the system, has no doubt helped. But fundamentally, the clinicians do want to work together and develop these subspecialised services, and are very, very much patient focused in all of that.
Fantastic. And perhaps got time for maybe just one more question, which was on my mind. Just looking at the slides, I wondered, how far do you feel you've managed to integrate the new approach into day jobs? And how far does it still feel like an add-on? Because looking at the slides cold, I felt a bit worried for you. You were doing all of that on top of all of your trust governance, but I wonder, does it feel like it's becoming more of a single way of working, or does it still feel like you're very stretched in terms of headspace, running a trust and running what's a new system collaborative approach?
Yeah, I think initially, until we got going with it, it did feel a little bit like an add-on, but I think there is an infrastructure to some of the things that I've described. So I do chair the Elective and Diagnostic Board and the Cancer Board, but I have got an infrastructure that supports me with that. I've also got a programme director that reports into Jonathan and I, with a PMO team as well, to do some of that work. Now, we didn't have that initially, so it felt like I was being pulled, and Jonathan probably felt the same. We were being pulled in many directions, but actually it's got easier because that programme director's functioning, is working in an incredibly effective way, keeps us informed, which is not intrusive. We have regular catch-ups with all of the clinical leads, so it really just feels like part of what we do now, whereas at the beginning 18 months ago it didn't quite feel like that. I thought, how am I going to fit that in, you know, when can I do that? But no, it definitely feels more like part of the day job.
It's good to hear. Well, colleagues, I'm mindful of time. It's been such an interesting session, and as ever, we could speak to all of our presenters for a lot longer. But I'm just going to sum up a few kind of key takeaways for me really briefly, and then make some closing remarks. So. Thank you to all of our presenters today, to Paul, Christian, James, Diane and Jonathan, and to all of you for attending as well. I know it remains incredibly busy, so thanks for giving us a bit of your time. My takeaways were, I think, around being comfortable with what might be quite an iterative process and sort of learning as you go, not being afraid to make a start with a particular model and kind of see it evolve. I think we heard that from all of our presenters today. There was certainly a strong theme for me around kind of getting behind the outcome, so getting consensus and building the energy behind the outcome, the clinical outcome for the patient, without rather than getting sort of tied up in describing governance, or getting tied up in trying to sort that out first, being driven by what you're trying to do. There's some interesting stuff, I think, about working with commissioners actually in there that we might want to revisit. So lots of good comments about working with the ICB and using their motivation to do things differently as well. Embracing quite diverse partnerships. I think both case studies demonstrated that, different providers within the partnerships working in different ways. And as ever, as we always conclude, being clinically led. Really fantastic example there from Jonathan about being clinically led in the new pathways that they're developing across the system. So a huge amount of learning there. Thank you. We will share summaries of the case studies with the slides after the event. So you'll get those in your inbox. If you have a chance to fill out the evaluation form, that would be fantastic. We are finalising our programme for next year, and we want to include some events which will be slightly deeper dive learning, a bit more both based on peer learning and action learning. If you're interested in that, stay in touch with us. So any comments, thoughts, hot topics that you want us to cover in the coming year, we take that very seriously. So please fill out the form or drop us a line and let us know. I've been asked to tell you, if there's time, that we do have a couple of slots held in the coming year. So 23rd of May, we'll be looking at lessons learned and challenges ahead for provider collabs at scale. And we've also got a date held in July looking at delegation from ICBs to provider collabs, which would be really interesting, I think, given what we heard today as well. So it just remains for me to say thank you to you all for coming, and to our speakers in particular, and we will hope to see you all again soon.